Morning, everybody. This is my first presentation, so I'm quite new to this. I've not had the best prep this week, but I'm here today to give it a go. The topic is cybersecurity risk management. The subtitle is Simple Approach to Preliminary Risk Assessment. We should all really know what risk management is, and we should all know why, because each year cybersecurity threats happen. Data breaches happen, attack vectors happen, and new vulnerabilities occur. At the start of all of this, when you're doing a risk management, you will do a preliminary risk assessment first, and there can be a tendency to overcomplicate based on the information provided or not provided. And this presentation will aim to sort of set the story about how I perceive it at the moment. My background in security started from being within databases for several years, and then I moved across from infrastructure to security towards data security, and then I moved again into GRC. So I've seen multiple sides of the fence. So I understand why, if I'm not getting context, it's hard for me to translate that down the chain. And the more reading I do when I joined GRC, I realize that the message is not getting translated up the levels that it should be. And that's because risk starts fundamentally, or I think it starts fundamentally at a lower position, which will be my next slide. So, yeah, I think I've covered that about me, presentation, new challenge, and journey. So let's go on to the next slide. So, I perceive, and I could be wrong, call me out, it's not a problem, it's just an opinion. There's a possible disconnect between the non-technical and the technical teams within security. Particularly when I talk about non-technical, I say GRC, and this perception maybe tick box, policy-driven, business-focused, and this potentially will stem from cross-training within security. And the same happens on the other side within technical teams. You have and predominantly most of you here will be from that side, hence why I'm speaking to the audience. Application, product security, SOC. And then to back it all up with, you've got an evolving threat landscape, attack tree analysis, heavily vulnerability focused, which will be my next slide. But again, limited cross-training. So it's the same side of the coin in terms of maybe not seeing. But it is a generalization. I'm not saying neither one nor the other in terms of can see it, but it's just the cross-training element is maybe the rationale why risks aren't maybe always getting easily translated in the form of insufficient context, communication, and missing information. There's also an element of bias, which might come to later on, but that may explain why you're not getting the full information too. So, stemming from technical teams is vulnerability management. It's just a sort of segue into risk management. But the point is you can't really go into particularly technical risk management if you don't have the context of vulnerability management, because they have to come from somewhere. So again, just a few bullet points of attack frameworks, CIS controls, comprehensive scanning. You've got your CVEs, lots of them. There's a scoring system too, and they all mostly derive from your vulnerability management systems that will give you the relevant CVEs, which you then go pass up the chain along. So, I have this slide in this because when I checked on the CVE website, there are 218,239 CVE records. In theory, that translates to a lot of risks. So it's just a case of how to make sense of that. But then it's a case of how do technical teams confer that risk to the non-technical team. So it's that and what might get lost in translation along the way or not said along the way. So that's why it's relevant to talk about vulnerability management before you get into risk management, because they're obviously intertwined. There are other risks out there, I get that, but this is cybersecurity and this is a security event, so we start with vulnerability management. Okay. I'm not going to go into detail on vulnerabilities themselves because it's accepted, we know what they are. It's just more that technical security teams highlight a security problem in the form of complex security vulnerabilities. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. And then it's the job or the remit of cybersecurity risk management to sort of translate that down into a readable risk that can go up the chain. So for this slide, I should really talk about what is risk management. Won't go into too much detail because it's accepted that it's an umbrella terminology. It's framework based. It's ongoing process. There are multiple stakeholders. It involves people, process, technology. You have to align to your appetite, tolerance. That's the organizations, and it fundamentally forms a process of identification, analysis, and evaluation, leading towards acceptance or treatment. But within that, there are multiple components. And today, I'm only really going to talk about the preliminary risk assessment, which I probably should have said at the beginning, but just one aspect of risk management. So this topic in itself is an entirely separate slide. Sorry, an entirely separate presentation. Could go on for another hour or so. But I just wanted to have this in here to sort of set the context for the next slide, which is risk assessments. But the premise of cybersecurity management is that there is a process there to do risks, basically. And it can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be. But it sometimes gets complicated because there are many frameworks out there that try to say to do this or that. But what they do tend to either overlook is the preliminary aspect to it, which will lead me on to risk assessments. I thought I'd add a bit of colour, just because. So risk assessments, generally, what is the purpose? What is the scope? What are the priorities? What are the constraints? Who is doing the assessment? Everything you need to work with or need to ask the questions about will form the basis of your risk assessment. It's essentially an ongoing activity that helps your business identify any threats or vulnerabilities and maintains compliance regulations. This is all very standard stuff. It's not particularly exciting, but the point is it's a component of risk management. You can't do one without the other, and it just naturally stems. But the point is, if you go into detail in risk assessment, there are multiple. If I go down my slide, there are multiple aspects of risk assessments. Components. But the main one that I'm focusing on today will be preliminary risk assessment. And for these, I have, at a very high level, just outlined 3 that I felt were needed when doing a preliminary risk assessment. And that's what I wanted to sort of focus on right now. The business context, the system scope, and the risk profile. So the business context is key. A lot of people talk about business context because it's about translating essentially a technical vulnerability into the business. What does it mean for the business up and down the chain? System scope. Whereabouts within the organization is it facing? So when you're looking at it, it's going, well, is this internal, external? Is it this service or that service? Is it limited here or there? And risk profile. What I was advised was to look at this triangle, which inverts the CIA triad into a very simple risk profile for 3&U. And usually risks can be sort of based within that triangle. in terms of disclosure, alteration, and denial. Obviously, the deeper you go, the more you can add, more context. But the point is, without these three, you can't really do a risk assessment. So, the challenges that you can get, particularly I face, is that you get a lack of context, a lack of communication, and just a lack of information when you're getting the information you need in order to do your risk assessments. But then the role of, say, the non-technical GRC is to translate that, to get that information, to translate it into this. Value chains essentially are how you go up the way in the terms of the organization, in terms of explaining it. So every business will have value chains. It's what makes a business. But then it's about prioritizing that, because not every risk needs to be perceived, or not every vulnerability needs to be perceived as a risk. Not every risk needs to be prioritized in a certain way. So it's just taking the vulnerability or the technical vulnerability and putting a certain level of context around it. A story. Working example. Really simple, because the whole thing was, in theory, been simple. I've tried to keep it simple. So we're all familiar with end-of-life production servers. So it's just taking those three concepts and saying, look, what does it mean when you're doing a preliminary risk assessment? Decision, summary, and in that summary, your decision should be just your main title, and your summary should be your business context, your system scope, and your profile. So I think then, I've got 3 minutes remaining, we'll go to the last slide for takeaways. Hopefully I've conveyed that between the technical and non-technical teams, there should be a shared vision. And in doing so, we'll instill a risk management culture. Business context equal business value. And I think, according to certain people in 2024, or if not already happening, people will be asking, what does this mean? How do I explain this to somebody else in order to get this risk treated, looked at, mitigated? Basically, how do I get the money to resolve the problem? And it's without business context, you won't infer that business value, therefore you won't maybe get the money to solve the risk itself. So it's a balance between wanting to flag the risk, but also wanting to resolve it from a security standpoint, but also acknowledging the relevance to the business itself. I've talked through the methodology. Again, simple, I get that, but it's only one aspect of a much bigger process, but it has to start somewhere. Fundamentally, it's repeatable, and it has to be repeatable, because there are lots of them, and they won't stop, and there'll just be more. So it's about filtering as well. And the point of that repeatable process will allow you then to filter. So you start with your prelim assessment, and you can basically say, this is a risk, this is not a risk, this is a risk, this is not a risk. A few useful links in my research, but you're probably already familiar. But if you're not, and you're from maybe a non-technical, it's worth considering particularly the attack frameworks and the controls, because they help give added context to see it from the other side of the coin from a technical perspective. Cool. Thank you very much.